In a year full of great psychological horror mysteries, one film stood out: The Censor. This is the story of a woman haunted by a terrifying past. Her job? To watch horrifying content every single day. But one day, she comes across a disturbing film. And what she sees connects to her own dark past. Secrets begin to unravel. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The story begins in the 1980s UK, a time when cinema was evolving. A whole new era of films was emerging. And in the midst of it all, our protagonist, Enid, a lonely woman who works for the British Film Censorship Board. Her job? To review films before their release, especially those filled with disturbing imagery. You all must be familiar with film censorship. Well, this story takes us deep inside that world. Enid and her co-worker sit down to review a low-budget horror film. As film reviewers, it is their responsibility to decide which scenes are suitable for public viewing and which must be removed. Back in those days, such films were called video nasties. As Enid watches the film, she comes across a particularly violent scene. A horrifying shot of someone's eye being gouged out. Her reaction? Immediate rejection. "This scene is too violent," she declares, but her colleague disagrees. He argues that they should consider the film's intellectual depth. Yet, Enid stands her ground. She insists that for the public, this scene is far too risky. And so, the scene is censored. During this time, the British government had imposed a strict ban on violent content. Their reason? A sharp rise in crime rates. News channels were flooded with reports, claiming that these films were to blame. And so, the job of film reviewers like Enid became even more crucial. They had to analyze every detail and ensure that violent scenes were properly censored. What happens next? How does Enid's past intertwine with the film she watches? And what horrors lie ahead? Find out in The Censor, a film that takes you deep into the psychological terror of memory, trauma, and horror cinema. Some films were censored, others rejected completely, especially the ones that were too violent. This was mostly the case with slasher films. After reviewing the film, the censorship board held a meeting. Some members were against these strict rules. They believed that horror and slasher films were being treated unfairly. But the truth was, films do have an impact on the human mind. And so, based on Enid's decision, that film was censored. That night, Enid stayed late at work. Everyone else had already left. On her way home, she saw a woman with red hair in the alley. She called out to her. The woman turned around. But it wasn't who Enid thought. The truth is, Enid had a sister. Her name was Nina. She too had red hair. When they were kids, the two of them went into the woods together. But that day, Nina never came back. She disappeared. No one knew if she was alive or dead. And from that moment on, this haunting memory never left Enid. She never got married. She never let anyone in. She lived alone, even her parents. She barely spoke to them, because deep down, she blamed herself. Nina was younger than her, and Enid had been the one who took her into the woods. Back home, she received a voicemail from her mother, an invitation to dinner. She hesitated, but eventually, she went to meet them. That night, her parents had something important to tell her. They handed her a death certificate. It was Nina's. Years had passed, and they had accepted that Nina was gone. At least now, they could find some peace. The date of death? The same day she disappeared into the woods. But Enid refused to accept it. She had never seen Nina's body. For her, it wasn't real. Her mother tried to explain, You don't remember everything, my dear. But Enid's mind was crumbling. Depression began to consume her. The next day, Enid and her co-worker were reviewing another film, Extreme Code. On screen, a horrifying scene unfolded. A grotesque-looking man was assaulting a young girl. What happens next? How does Enid's past collide with her present? And what dark truths will she uncover? Find out in The Censor, a psychological horror film that delves into the mind, trauma, and the power of cinema. In real life, Enid's sister had gone missing, and now she felt like the actress in that film. Alice Lee looked exactly like Nina. After watching the film, Enid's condition worsened. That night, she had a terrifying nightmare. She saw her younger self inside a scene from the film. There, Nina was calling her. "Come inside." Enid stepped into the cabin, and suddenly, she saw her mother, yelling at her, screaming. She woke up, gasping for breath, but her mind was beginning to break. Her job had already taken a toll on her, watching horrific films every day, and the pain of losing her sister never left her. But now, that pain was growing worse, especially after her parents accepted Nina's death. Enid refused to. The next day, at work, a thought crept into her mind. What if the actress she saw in the film was actually Nina? And what if the disturbing scenes in the movie were real? Could the director be a criminal? Could he have kidnapped Nina? Of course, it sounded insane, but Enid believed it. She had to find Alice Lee. Her search led her to the film's director, Frederick North. She needed to watch his past films, but getting them from the censorship board archives would take weeks. Enid didn't have time to wait, so she went to a video store, a shady place, where the owner rented out banned films, and she caught him red-handed. Afraid of getting in trouble, he handed her a film by Frederick North, and in it, the same actress appeared, Alice Lee. This time, Enid was certain. Those eyes, they belonged to Nina. She rushed to tell her parents, but they refused to believe her. They wanted to forget, but Enid kept bringing it all back. The argument escalated until finally, they told her to leave. No one believed her. No one listened. So, frustrated and desperate, Enid went to Doug's house. She needed answers. She had to know the truth about Alice Lee. What happens next? Does Enid uncover the horrifying truth behind the film? Or is it all just a delusion? Find out in The Censor, a psychological horror thriller. That will leave you questioning reality itself. But Doug had something else in mind. He wanted to sleep with Enid. And so, he assumed maybe she was just obsessed with his films. But Enid accused him. "You people have kidnapped my sister." Doug lunged at her, tried to force himself on her. A struggle broke out, and in the chaos, Doug slipped. His own film award, sharp, heavy, pierced through his skull. Doug was dead. But Enid, she didn't panic. She didn't run. She simply took a shower and walked away. The next day at the office, she dug deeper. She needed to know. Where was Frederick North's latest film being shot? She had to find Alice Lee to finally bring Nina home. That night, she arrived at the shooting location. A dark, eerie forest, lights, cameras, and actors in grotesque makeup. The makeup artist assumed she was just another actress. And Enid, she played along. She sat in the chair, allowed them to paint her face, to prepare her for the most dangerous scene in the film. Then she met Frederick North, the director. The man she suspected stole her sister. She studied him, searching. Was he really a monster? Was Nina here? Was he about to kill her? But North thought she was just another actress, a desperate girl trying to impress him. And in a way, he was impressed. The scene began. a bloody axe in Enid's hands. She stepped into the cabin, and there, a deformed, monstrous man held Alice captive. He looked at Enid and growled, "Kill her! End it!" But Enid couldn't. She wasn't here to kill her sister. She was here to save her. Except this was just a film. It was all fake, just a scene. But to Enid, it wasn't. To her, this was real. She swung the axe and killed the man. For real. The entire set fell silent, eyes wide in shock. Alice screamed. The director rushed in, but Enid had changed. She wasn't done. With a blank expression, she lifted the axe and beheaded Frederick North. Alice ran, through the trees, through the darkness, terrified. But Enid followed. "Wait!" she called. "Nina, stop!" But Alice turned, her voice shaking. "I am not your sister. Leave me alone." Hearing this, Enid collapsed onto the ground, and she wept. But then, the scene shifted. We were no longer in reality. Now we had stepped inside her mind. In Enid's imagination, Alice transformed. She was no longer Alice Lee. She was Nina, her lost sister. The world around them filled with color. Vivid, warm, safe. Enid walked hand in hand with Nina, taking her home. The radio crackled, announcing the news. The bad people have been punished. There will be no more crime. No more kidnappings. No more deaths. She brought Nina to their parents, and the moment they saw her, their eyes filled with joy. A happy reunion. A perfect ending. Enid turned to the camera and smiled. But then, reality snapped back. It was all a delusion. In truth, she hadn't brought Nina home. She had dragged Alice, kicking, screaming, terrified. And her parents? They weren't happy. They were horrified. Because the girl Enid had saved wasn't Nina. And Enid? She was completely, utterly insane. Her mind had shattered, under the weight of her guilt. She couldn't accept the truth, that Nina had died, maybe because of her. So in the end, she built her own world. A world where Nina was alive. A world where she was a hero. A world where she could be happy. And that is the true horror of Censor. A chilling study of a mind consumed by trauma, where the line between reality and fantasy ceases to exist. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you like this video, hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe.